Well, good afternoon, DPM. I think, first of all, those of you who know you know that you're a very modest person. And for you to say that this is not a luncheon address and only opening remarks, I think we would all agree that you've had a very far-ranging exploration of a lot of issues that really defies easy capture in a single phrase by anyone here. In a way, you also told me earlier that you had not, you didn't participate in the morning's lecture, the morning's presentation by President Yudhoyono, but in a way, your remarks perfectly synchronize with what he said. They're a completely perfect counterpoint to the optimism that he said, talked about the growing middle class and the internet connectivity and so on. And you've tempered all this with some very important remarks about how we can still be an optimistic region and yet must take stock of the challenges that face us. If I may just open with one question, sir. You know, you've, in your career in public service, occupied many different positions, and you've gone through a lot of experiences that have given you the perspective that you have today. And also to the extent that in Singapore, we never really want to blow our trumpet and say that there's anything that we can say that is of relevance to the region. But to the extent that we have had lessons of our own, and you've had lessons of your own, what would you say were some of the major lessons that you've gone through in your public life in terms of the challenges to Singapore, which you think might be of some relevance to our audience and to a larger region than Singapore itself?
Well, thank you, Kuan Ping. First, of course, I think we have to be genuinely modest about whether lessons can be transported from Singapore, a relatively small city-state, to larger and more complex societies. The second point I'd like to make is I think the most important lessons preceded my public life and really go back to the early days of Singapore's independence. We made strategic decisions. I'd say Mr. Lee Kuan Yew in particular and his team made strategic decisions which turned out to be major stabilizers for our society and a major source of cohesion in our society. Urban planning is sometimes thought of as a job of architects and transport planners and so on, but it's ultimately actually about the social dynamics of every neighborhood and every part of our city. In our case, we have just one city, so I talk about parts of a city. The most intrusive social policy in Singapore has turned out to be the most important one, and it's more intrusive than most liberal democracies would contemplate. And that is a rule on ethnic balance in every single block of public flats. And for those who are not familiar, public flats in Singapore, public housing is about 85% of the whole population. That's the norm for Singaporeans. So every single block and every single precinct has a rule on ethnic balance, which means that on the same floor and taking the same lifts up and down every day, you have a certain interaction that's just quiet and unstated and normal. But it also means critically that the kids go to kindergartens and primary schools that are integrated, because kids tend to go to schools that are quite close to where they live, especially when they are young. And when you grow up together, and you're not just in the same classroom together, but you're doing some sports and dance together, you just become more comfortable with each other. So being willing to have some intrusive rules in the interests of cohesion and the interests of preserving common space is, I think, critical. We did it in our own way, given our own circumstances, and there are different ways in other societies, but we can never think that the natural workings of society would somehow produce cohesion. Usually the opposite happens.
Thank you, sir. I think DPM's remarks clearly from the very beginning were tailored towards a much larger theme than Singapore alone. The remarks about how to have a sustainable, broad-based growth and also how to maintain social cohesion. These are problems that affect every society, and as you said, sir, from developed to developing. So can I open it now to the floor for anyone who'd like to have questions? Sir, please.
Thank you, Mr. Prime Minister, for your very, very insightful remarks. Two things. The first one, I think I'm Dr. Sohan from Korea. It's extremely important, you indicated, that how the political leaders in every country in Asia, how can they really persuade the people in their country that this open policy is important, not only export, import, and financial liberalization. The real cause of some kind of confusion or misunderstanding about tourism is the impact of export on creating jobs, because they are related with technology developments and the in terms of employment's intensity of export has been more rapidly dropping than domestic demands like consumption and so on. If you look at restaurants, they employ much more people than the factory which is actually producing a similar amount of value added and production. So how can we make these trends in the declining job creating capabilities of this open sector is compatible with some kind of harmonious creation of the society? The second one is that with this open policy, always in Asia, social safety net type of, some kind of security or safety policy is not very much compatible. So open policy always is regarded as, doing very harsh things about the people displaced. So job creation effects and the more intensification of our social safety nets may be the factors about the people's misunderstanding about the tourism. I would like to hear some of your wisdom on how the political leaders in Asia can persuade their people, regardless of these two, very important factors for understanding the tourism. What are the real strategy for us to make our people more convinced about open policy? Thank you.
I think those are two very important observations. Let me comment briefly. First, I think if we take the view that our objective in economic policy is to benefit the broad populace, not just the most talented or a small group of entrepreneurs, but the broad populace, it is our task as politicians to show how competition and an external orientation, participating in the world, brings benefits to you in your wages, in your ability to have new opportunities, for you to have a better job over time. That's our task. It has to be evidence-based, it cannot be rhetoric, and we need to use all the evidence we have from the firms that succeed, from the industries that succeed, to spread that message. There's nothing like success of a strategy, because success begets thinking in the mind that this is the right way for me to go as well. There's nothing like success. Getting an early start, making sure we succeed at it, succeed in participation in global markets is important, because the evidence is important. People must see a rise in living standards. I should add, however, that we all have now not just the race against demography that I was talking about earlier. I spoke earlier about how there's a very large bulge in the population that's going to enter the workforce soon. That's a race against demography. The second race we all have is against intelligent machines. Machines are getting more and more intelligent in every area, partly because of the digital revolution, but it's a whole range of innovations that's taking place. Even in China today, the cost of a robot has now become cheaper than the cost of a worker, at least in coastal China. The curves have crossed. It used to be that workers were far cheaper than robots. The cost curves have now changed, have crossed over. A robot is now cheaper than a worker. And that's in China, where wages have risen very significantly. China succeeded in its strategy, especially in the coastal provinces, but China too is going to face this challenge of the increasing use of efficient, cost-competitive machines to do what human beings could do before. Likewise, Singapore, Korea, many other countries, and the advanced countries. So we have to develop a whole new set of skills and aptitudes that make the most of the uniqueness of humans, that we have the ability to be creative, we have the ability to multitask, we have the ability to deal with uncertainty in a way that computers can't and machines generally can't. And not just restrict this form of training and nurturing to a few talented people, but to a broad majority in our society. That's a real challenge. But the benefits of participating in the world are real. They bring improvements in living standards, and we've got to have that as part of our political rhetoric that's based on evidence in all our countries. On your second question about social security, it's extremely important. In general, Asia has been behind the curve when it comes to social security. It's focused very much on the economic task of uplifting people from poverty, but we haven't focused enough on sustainability over time. What happens when people get older? What happens when they fall sick? What forms of insurance do we have? How do you provide a level of support for people that still ensures that people are responsible for themselves, that families take care of themselves, but provides for a level of collective support? This is an extremely important area. We know the problems in the West because they've got unsustainable social security systems, patently so. We've got to avoid those problems, but we've got to have a system that's fair for our people. So you can't just leave it to the market. You can't just leave it to people to fend for themselves. In every society, you need some degree of social support for those who are poor, for those who are ill when they get older, some form of social support. But how to do it in a way that's sustainable so that unlike the West, we don't put a bigger and bigger burden on the next generation. That's our challenge. That's what we have been spending a lot of time on in Singapore, developing a fair but sustainable social security system.
Thank you. Any other questions, please? Could you also introduce yourself so that DPM can understand the context of your question? Yes, back there, please.
My name is Charun Mokzani. I work for the Khazanah Research Institute. Thank you to Deputy Prime Minister for that magisterial overview of the challenges facing all of us. If I could just pick up on two of the things you said. Firstly, this issue of artificial intelligence and the hollowing out of the middle class. I share your fear, actually. We could get to a world where those who are either having lucky enough to inherit wealth or lucky enough to have the aptitude to succeed in this new world will be very wealthy, and we won't have any good jobs for anyone else. And so you'll either be extremely wealthy or work in services to serve the extremely wealthy, and that's quite a depressing future. The second thing is on social cohesion. You said very rightly that one of the successes in Singapore is that in public housing and public schooling, people had to mix. And that was true of Malaysia as well, certainly when I grew up. But the problem we have now is that if you're rich, you can opt out of this system. The wealthy, the privileged, those lucky enough to succeed, can create their own cocoon where they are, out. They don't have to deal with messy problems like poor people or people of a different color or of a different religion or of a different point of view. And how do you see social cohesion happening as we live in this new world of artificial intelligence, globalization, et cetera, et cetera? Thank you.
So I think that's a very good point, and there's a way in which the 2 points are related to each other, because the insecurity that people face as a result of technological advance and the changing nature of jobs, the middle class insecurity, is one that could easily weaken our sense of social cohesion as well on a much broader level. So we've got to tackle both problems. I'm not yet convinced that we are going to see the loss of what we call middle-class jobs, because there are two trends that are happening. First is machines are getting more intelligent and they're able to do what humans could do before. So they're taking over many routine jobs. Everything that has a well-defined set of tasks can be coded, done by machines, and also exported to the rest of the world. It can be done somewhere else. That is true. That's been the story of the United States and some advanced countries in the last few decades, a reduction in the middle-level jobs. But at the same time, there's another very important trend you notice, even in the advanced world, that employers say they cannot find people with the skills they need for what are very good jobs. So there are two things happening at the same time. Machines are taking over what human beings were doing before, but at the same time, there's a shortage of skills in the market. And I think if we apply our minds, shape our institutions, shape the curriculum, have lifelong learning to develop the skills of the future, there will be enough jobs and opportunities. So how we respond to the situation determines the outcome. If we take a defeatist attitude and say that, look, the machines are coming, well, good luck to you. But it need not be that way. There are enough jobs and enough opportunities that we create for ourselves by developing the skills and creating new demands, new services. So that's the first point. On your second point, I think you're touching on a very important issue about public schools versus private schools. It so happened in Singapore, we adopted a strategy of keeping the school system public. We have a very small number of privately funded schools, very small number, but they're not at the apex of the system. They're really there as a bit of a safety valve, and sometimes when parents have spent some time abroad and the kids are not schooled in the Singapore system, they find it easier to bring their kids back into this very small number of private schools. But they're not at the apex of the system. The system is a public school system, and we try and best as we can, and we have to keep working harder at it in making sure that it is one that sustains social mobility, regardless of whether it's your ethnicity or your social background or your parents' incomes. You've got to have a fair chance of succeeding. So keeping a public school system is critical, and not going the easy route of trying to develop excellence by allowing for more and more private schools. The US is a classic example. It may have some of the best private schools in the world, high schools. In fact, not just high schools, even starting from kindergarten. Some exceptional schools, very well resourced, very well motivated teachers, flexible curricula, not so exam focused, but looking at new projects every year. They shape their own curricula and tests. Wonderful schools. And they try and get the kids into the Ivy League colleges. But it's a tiny fraction of the US system. The US public school system is rotten. In fact, it's criminal. It's really criminal in terms of what it does for the average kid and the kid who comes from a below average socioeconomic background. And the US still succeeds because it has that entrepreneurial ability and that innovative ability coming out of the cream and by importing the best from the rest of the world. But the future for the average worker ain't great. In fact, in the last 30 years, there's been no improvement in median incomes, and by some estimates, actually a reduction in incomes in real terms for the average family and the average worker. So it's the most vibrant economy in the world when you think of entrepreneurship and innovation. But in terms of our central objective, and the objective of a very political system, which is to achieve broad prosperity and improvements in living standards, I would say it goes back to what you're doing in education, and it goes back to how you're helping everyone acquire skills and advance through life. So I say this not to hit at the US or to criticize any other country. It's what we should all reflect on. That's our central objective. And how do we start doing it early in life?
Thank you. Please. Microphone here, please.
Thank you. My name is Munir Majid from the ASEAN Business Advisory Council. Thank you, Kon Peng. DPM, I wonder whether you could share with us Singapore's experience in terms of cooperation and working together between the public and the private sectors. I ask this not just because it may be of relevance, to other countries individually. I also ask it because there's a lot of rhetoric in ASEAN about ASEAN working together with the private sector, and I see a lot of potholes and gaps in the way they propose or do not effectively work with the private sector in trying to achieve, social or economic objectives. Could you share with us your experience, how it might be translated into an ASEAN context? Thank you.
So it's a very difficult question, Munir, and let me just make two observations. First, some of the strategies that succeeded or appear to have succeeded in Japan and Korea in a much earlier phase, 50s, 60s, to some extent 70s, where the state took an active role in trying to promote certain industries and even individual firms. There's some contention amongst economists as to whether it really succeeded, but it was a phase of rapid economic growth. Those strategies are no longer open to countries today. First, because we've got stronger WTO rules. Second, because we really have to take in the evidence which shows that competition helps. Competition, both domestically as well as with the rest of the world, really helps. It spurs innovation. It allows living standards to improve. So I think foremost in our mind as economic policy makers has to be a mindset that's about competition, allowing for competition between firms in the same industry, exposing them to international competition, and for larger countries, also having competition between cities and between states and provinces. It's been a real motive force in economic development, a real motive force. And we need to strengthen that mindset in ASEAN as well as in the broader region, that competition really helps. The second observation I'll make, which is coming down one level, which is what are our instruments when you talk about private-public sector cooperation? I would say having measures which are transparent and across the board, such as tax incentives, where you say, for instance, that anyone who invests in R&D, I give you a certain tax deduction, or anyone who invests in mechanization or intellectual property, I give you a tax deduction. And it's very clear and transparent how many % deduction, and each firm makes its own calculation and is able to take advantage of the schemes. That's superior to a system of wanting to choose which firm should benefit or which industry should benefit. That's a second very broad observation I'll make. Tax incentives are a very useful way of supporting the private sector. A third point I should just make, by the way, is that in the social sphere, there's also a lot of scope for collaboration between the public and the private sector. And there are many examples all over Asia. For instance, in India, leading private corporations are remarkably innovative in what they do in the social sphere, in education, in water purification, in sanitization, in health delivery. Private corporations that have a sort of a social arm to them are amongst the leaders in innovation in delivery of social services. So that too is, I think, a very interesting dimension of public-private cooperation and a real opportunity for us, tapping on the technologies and the management mindsets of the private sector, which were developed for market reasons, because they're in competitive markets, tapping on those same capabilities for the development of social services and delivery of social services. I think that's an interesting opportunity as well.
Yes, please.
My name is Chung-Min Lee from Seoul, Korea, and I met you at DPM when you were Minister of Education many years back. My question, sir, is there's a sense in Asia that Asia's rise will go on forever. And I think that type of assumption is both very arrogant and perhaps even wrong. for two reasons. If you look at demographic trends in China, Japan, and even the richer parts of Asia, they're quite negative. By the mid of this century, in 2050, Japan's population at current fertility rate will fall to about 85 million. By 2100, some reports say Japan's population will fall to 47 million. So in 50 years' time, grandmas and grandpas won't be joining the SDF. So my question to you, sir, is how can Asia make sure that these negative demographic drivers in Korea, in Singapore, Hong Kong, etc., can be overcome? And my second question is, virtually every single major country in this region has huge growing income inequality. And that will have social and political repercussions. In some regions, it is already happening. So how can you, as one of the key leaders of this country, look into those two issues and offer some sage advice? Thank you.
So, another very important and difficult question that confronts many of us already and will eventually confront all our societies. First, I think there are some opportunities to be gained. Aging is not all about the negatives, it's also about the positives. Our people are, one of the wonderful things is that people are much healthier than they used to be. And the reason why we've now got remarkable longevity in many of our societies is because of advances in medical science, different jobs that people did throughout their careers, and they're just able to live healthier lives for longer. Let's try and make the most of it. How can people keep learning even when they're well past their 50s or even past their 60s? How can they stay active? Active economically or active in the community? There's a real opportunity, and there's some lessons to be taken from some of the other advanced countries who are less ageist than us, because Asia is still a rather ageist place. There's some countries where people are able to stay very active in the workforce, are respected for the skills they have, for the wisdom they bring to the workplace, and customers and the public treat them with a certain respect. There's some lessons. We've got to treat everyone who's an older worker with respect and not see them as having reached the end of the road and we're just keeping them employed and giving them a wage. It's not just makan gaji, It's about trying to see how they too actually want to do a better job. How you can shape the job around them so as to maximize their potential. So maximizing our potential at every age is, I think, a very important mindset. Second point, however, is, as I mentioned earlier on, we've got to avoid the mistakes of Europe and the United States, which have unsustainable social security systems. We've got to be fair to the low-income aged without imposing a burden on the younger population, which is the mistake they've made. So it does mean that we shouldn't be too generous with the affluent aged. You've got to have schemes which target support at those who are poor, those who are ill without family support. Target our support at them. Because once you start extending the support to everyone who gets older, you're going to impose a big burden on the next generation. And it's an unsustainable burden.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Thank you. This is Ishar Aluwalia from
You're supposed to
New
ask an
Delhi.
easy question, by the way.
I can't resist, after hearing you on public-private cooperation, asking you about your wisdom on the role of public-private partnerships, particularly in financing infrastructure. Some years ago in India, we saw this as a major institutional innovation, but right now we are going through a phase where we feel that it's not really working. We need a dispute resolution mechanism, and there are all kinds of problems. I'd like to know, for governments which don't have financing to put in place the infrastructure that they need, is there a role for public-private partnership? And how can we ensure that private sector puts in finances to bridge this gap?
So it's a very good question. First, I would say the short answer is I think the private sector's participation in public infrastructure is still a big opportunity, and it's going to be necessary. It's going to be necessary because public finances around the region are in finite supply, but the demand for infrastructure is great. There is money waiting on the sidelines. There's a lot of private money waiting on the sidelines. Insurance funds, pension funds, a lot of long-term money that's waiting on the sidelines. And there's a lot of demand for new infrastructural projects. And we've got to find a way of matching that money waiting on the sidelines with the demand. The public sector itself cannot finance that demand. So our task is to have predictable regulatory frameworks that are fair to the consumer, not just fair to the private sector provider, but it's got to be predictable for the private sector provider. And the problem in the past has been that there's been too much unpredictability in PPP partnerships. So when problems arise, as they will from time to time, there's a loss of confidence that comes about because of a messy dispute resolution system. So building standard clauses into contracts upfront, standard clauses on dispute resolution is critical. Second opportunity is this. The banks are flush with funds, and there's still no lack of banks who are willing to put money into infrastructural finance, assuming these are bankable projects. But we really have to think ahead. It'll be a matter of years before the banks themselves are not going to be the major sources of finance for infrastructure, and you need the capital markets. And the capital markets need to be developed in Asia to be able to sustain infrastructural funding. The banks will typically go in at what's called the greenfield stage, because the capital markets usually don't get involved at the greenfield stage. But beyond the greenfield stage, beyond the construction stage, basically, there's ample scope for capital markets to be developed through infrastructure bonds and other means, so that long-term investors like pension funds and others, they come in and take over the role of banks beyond that construction stage. This again requires predictable regulation and very clear clauses and provisions in the loan documents and the contract documents upfront. So to enable this handover from banks to the capital markets. Because the capital markets, as individuals all over the world, they cannot deal with uncertainty, much less so than banks can. So you need very clear regulation, dispute resolution clauses, and all the clauses that matter when problems arise. That has to be clearly set out upfront. Fortunately, this is not rocket science. There are good examples already. We can borrow from those examples and standardize this. Standardize this. In Asia, we should have standard documentation. This is something which we are now developing, and the AIIB and others are going to be quite active in ensuring that we've got this ability to spur private finance in a major way so as to complement public finance.
Thank you. Another question, please. Oh, there, please, number 5.
Hi, my name is Wan Saiful Wanjan. I'm from the Institute for Democracy and Economic Affairs, IDEAS in Malaysia. I want to follow up on some of the answers that you gave to the previous questions. And I want to ask 2 very specific and quite narrowly focused questions, if you don't mind. Firstly, how do you reconcile your enthusiasm and the answers that you've given on the market economy with the government's role and even ownership of businesses in Singapore and maybe even in this region? And secondly, what is Singapore's position at the moment with regards to the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiation? What is Singapore's position on the state-owned enterprise chapter?
So the 2 questions are related and they're important ones. In general, state-owned enterprise hasn't had a very good record internationally. Whether you're talking about the United Kingdom and France, or you talk about many Asian countries, it hasn't had a very good record. And the main reason it hasn't had a good record is because there's favorable finance that's being provided, and favorable finance almost on a permanent basis, and the incumbents, the people who run the organizations, assume that they're there basically for political reasons and their jobs are secure. there's nothing inherently wrong with state enterprise if we don't follow those practices. In other words, if we subject state enterprises to the competition of the market in every sense, there's nothing inherently wrong with state enterprise. The reason why state enterprises in Singapore are by and large profitable, are competing internationally, and by the way, as a norm, tend to have significant private shareholding as well, including foreign shareholding, is because they are subjected to the marketplace. There's no favor that is given to them. The relationship between the Ministry of Finance, for instance, which is 100% owner of Temasek, is simply that of having a way in which we can tap on the investment income they earn for the purpose of our budget. We never get involved at all in their business decisions, their choice of investments, the way they manage their enterprises. And likewise within Temasek, between the holding company and the subsidiary companies, there's a relationship that ensures that the subsidiary companies are subjected to the marketplace. So it's a very important issue of governance. As shareholder, we want returns, and we want returns for the long term so that we can spend them on our budget. For us to get these returns on a sustainable basis, we've got to preserve the independence of the state-owned enterprises and subject them to competition in a market economy. That's broadly speaking my answer to your question, but it's a very important question.
Yes, please.
I'm Ronaldo Llamas, Minister for Political Affairs from the Philippines. Singapore is a great model for a synergy between sustained growth and equity and social protection. And to a great extent, it gives you that competitive edge in the global economy. But in significant parts of the Asian region, equity is more a deficit. Based from your experience, not providing a formula, but what are the tips and lessons for the region wherein we don't only pump prime growth and competition, but we pump prime equity, or else it will create some social and political landmines which may explode sooner or later. Thank you.
So it's a very complex field, how we achieve growth with equity, and I'm not going to pretend to give you a comprehensive answer. I would just highlight two features of our experience, which may or may not be relevant to others. One was the criticality of home ownership. Your standard of living is not just your wages, it's also your assets and your sense of security that comes from owning a home. And that's been a critical part of the Singapore strategy from early on. The fact that the working class, the ordinary man and woman, were able to own their homes. The fact that till today, if you look at the bottom 20% of households by income, over 80% of them own homes. That's actually a very important part of Singapore's social and economic story, home ownership. Once you own a home, it gives you pride. It also means you're likely to stay in the job. You're likely to stay employed because you want to make sure you can service the mortgage on your home. You don't want to lose the home. It also means that in a way that may not be people may not be so conscious of it, but they know that when the economy is doing well, when there's prosperity that's shared, they know the value of their home goes up as well. And that makes the population interested in economic prosperity. That too is an advantage. The second point I'll make, without elaborating, is the criticality of education that's aimed at the majority, not just the most talented, not just those who go to the private schools, as was asked earlier, but an education that's aimed at raising the averages. Raising the averages. That's really critical.
We have time for probably only one more question. Is anyone who has a question?
By the way, lest it be thought that Singapore has all these wonderful lessons for everyone else, let me just repeat that very little was actually invented in Singapore. Almost everything we did was done by first going out to the rest of the world, trying to spot lessons that we could get from them, someone who's already done an innovation, whether it's social or economic or technological, and then seeing how we could apply it in Singapore. That's the SOP in every single agency, every single public agency. That's the standard operating procedure. It came partly because we are a small country, small young country, so by force of circumstance, we had to look outward. But this mindset of not thinking you've already got it in your own head and you've already worked out the best ways is a very useful mindset. Looking out for the best lessons internationally and trying to see how we can import them into our own societies is a very useful mindset. Singapore was not the source of wisdom. We merely borrowed, adapted, and tried to do things a little better.
DPM, I think for all of us who have ever been involved with anything that the Singapore government has done, we can certainly testify that there are so many study missions abroad to study every issue to death before we do anything. So it is absolutely true that we really study whatever's out there, and then I guess we try to take different pieces and try to create something that is uniquely Singaporean. I think we've come to the end of today's session. DPM, as the last of three keynote speakers, you had, so to speak, the last word. And if I may say, to me, the last word that you said, which you said several times, that is my main takeaway, are your words that nothing is preordained. And I think that's a very timely reminder for all of us here today, because we wouldn't be here if we did not believe in the Asian century that President Yudhoyono spoke about. We wouldn't be here if we were not essentially optimists. But it's also too easy to be caught by hubris, complacency, and to believe that this Asian century is going to come about. I think you've given us some very timely reminders, and of the specific issues of how nothing is preordained and how we need a lot of hard work, attention to detail, and attention to all the potential social fractures that are out there in order to achieve the Asian century. So could I ask all of you to, on behalf of all of us, could I thank you then for your participation today, sir? Thank you.
Right.
Thank you.